Welcome to Cryptic Accounts, the podcast by paranoid people for paranoid people. I'm your host for the week, Dennis Cheney, and on this episode we have The Mysteries of the Shroud of Turin. I'm joined as always by Patrick Ryan. How are you doing? And answer honestly, Patrick. I care
I'm
about you.
I'm doing just wonderfully.
Okay, good.
Doing great. Excited to
Not
be here.
not gonna dig into that anymore. Have you heard of the Shroud of Have you heard of the Shroud of Turin?
No, I have not.
Really?
I don't think so. It kind of sounds familiar, but I couldn't tell you what it is.
Oh. That really fascinates me. Okay, we're going back to our Christian roots this episode. Um, so let's just get into it, I guess.
Teach me about it, Dennis. The Shroud of Turin.
So I start out with an image here. Um, and this is an X-ray, basically, of the shroud. And as you can see, it's a bearded man with some other images around him. He's seems to be wrapped up in something. He's covering his genitals. I've set a new record for saying genitals this early in a show. Have you ever seen this image before? I guess is what I should say.
No, what is this? This is creepy looking, first of all.
Oh, you're in for a ride, my man. So much of the early story of the shroud is fragmentary. Some is only circumstantial and some mere legend. Nonetheless, much of what we do know is clear and corroborated and documented in history. It is a history that tells us of the Shroud of Turin and the Edessa cloth are most likely one and the same piece of cloth. So we're going to interchangeably use Shroud of Turin and Edessa cloth.
Okay.
Somehow and at some time, a cloth with what was believed to be the image of Jesus turned up in Edessa. Legend tells us it was brought to King Abgar V, the ruler of Edessa, by one of Jesus's disciples, perhaps Thaddeus Jude. That much is legend. That it is legend does not make it untrue, however. There may very well be a core of truth in this legend, as there are in many legends. We know that the cloth was hidden away. We don't know when or why. It could well have been because of floods to which Edessa was prone, because of the threat of invasion, or because of the Christian persecutions. What is not legend is that the cloth, with an image of what everyone then believed was the image of Jesus, was discovered in the walls of the city in the 6th century.
Okay, so is the cloth this X-ray thing that we just looked at?
So, the X-ray thing we just looked at is the Shroud of Turin.
Okay.
It's believed by, and I've put the sources in the show notes, it's believed by some academics that the Shroud of Turin is the same as the Edessa cloth.
Okay.
And the Edessa cloth gets into a whole bunch of stories. Like there's also some fragments, which I didn't include in this episode. There's some fragments of parchment, which are alleged to be the written correspondence of Jesus and the king of what is now Turkey.
Really?
Yeah. Some people say it's a 3rd century forgery. Others say it might be legit. It's Jesus transcribing the same way Paul did in some of his letters. And I read some of them. You can look these up. If you look up like the legends of Edessa, the cloth of Edessa, you'll find this very quickly. I put a link in here to what's called the Abgar legend, which is the legend of these letters basically back and forth between Jesus and this king.
Okay.
That I had never heard about until I started researching the show.
Yeah, I haven't either.
So there might be a future show on that. And it sounds very much like how Jesus sounds in the Bible, but also if it's a forgery from the 3rd century, we'd already basically compiled the Bible. So it's kind of like, I don't know, you can go back and forth on it. But what we do know is that part of this legend that is very old is that Thaddeus Jude, otherwise known as Saint Jude, brought a cloth basically to this king Abgar, who was very sick, as we'll get into, and had basically heard about Jesus and wanted to be healed by him. And so they brought him this cloth that Jesus had basically imprinted his face on. Um, and basically there's a corresponding letter that's basically like, thank you for believing in me without even meeting me, like as the scriptures have foretold. It's very New Testament-y. But there is this legend of this cloth that seems to correspond with also the history of the shroud. So it's believed that possibly the shroud and the Odessa cloth are the same thing.
Okay.
So um let's see here. So the Trail of the Shroud's historical journey, and this is mostly about the Shroud. The Tale of the Shroud's historical journey north begins in the city-state of Edessa, in what is now Turkey, where a king dying of leprosy was presented with the shroud by a Christian disciple. History records that King Abgar was healed after coming in contact with the shroud. A number of years later, a pagan king came to power, and the shroud was hidden away for safekeeping. Reappeared or was rediscovered 300 years later in 525 AD as the linen cloth with the mysterious image of Christ on it. It is believed to have been moved to Constantinople in 944 AD. A burial cloth, which some historians maintain was the shroud, was known by the Byzantine emperors, but disappeared during the sack of Constantinople in 1204. So prior to 1204, basically, it was just this legend that this king who believed in Jesus up in Turkey got this. He hid it away when some pagans took over. We do know that it was rediscovered, or it was moved to Constantinople around the turn of the millennia, and then it disappeared again when Constantinople was sacked. So in 525 AD, during repairs of city walls, or more likely in 544, during a Persian invasion of Edessa, the cloth was recovered and placed in a church built especially for it. Then in 944, Emperor Romanus I sent an army to remove the Edessa cloth and transfer it to his capital in Constantinople. There it remained until 1204, when it disappeared during the sacking of the city by the Crusaders of the Fourth Crusades. During its known history, the Edessa cloth was variously described as a divinely wrought image and an image not made by hand. A painting in the 10th century shows a cloth with an image of Jesus being held by King Abgar V. Clearly inspired by the legendary story, it is significant to note the width of the cloth and the centrality of the facial image suggests that it might be the folded shroud. We know that the Crusaders of the Fourth Crusade looted the treasures of Constantinople in 1204 and carried away many riches and relics. There is good evidence that the Edessa cloth was taken to Athens around this time. Then, about 150 years later, the shroud was displayed in Europe for the first time in the small town of Lyre, France. So basically, what we're getting at here is that there is this real relic, this real image called the Shroud of Turin, which is what we started out with, that image, which some believe, as we'll get into, is the burial cloth of Christ.
That whole first image you were showing,
Yes.
that thing's the burial cloth of Christ.
Some people believe, for a few reasons, because of some anomalies with it. And it also seems, and a lot of people have, as we'll see, there's a lot of controversy about its age, but there's tons of historical stories about this Edessa cloth, which seem to line up, including like its size and shape and stuff, with that shroud. And we have more pictures of the shroud, so we'll get into what makes it so special.
Okay. So basically, so to clarify, just so I make sure I'm understanding. So the piece that is the face that got sent to Abgar the Fifth is the cutout of the face from this first thing that we're looking at. Is that what they're saying? It's a piece
of believed, it. Well, it's This author believes that it's the same shroud,
So it
and
would be
that
a piece of that.
it'd be a piece of that, or more likely the whole thing, if we believe that it's the same as the Odessa cloth, and that somehow it just got shortened down into his face for whatever reason.
See, that's the part that was throwing me. I think is
Yeah, and
that it
that's kind
refers to the
of
face, and this is a whole body. Like this is the whole thing.
right. And I don't want you to get too caught up on these two things being the same thing. This is just a possible historical link that puts the shroud back early enough to be handled by a disciple.
Well, I'll try not to stay too attached to it, but right now that's all I got to hang on to.
No, no, you're right. And let's see how to put this. So, like it said though, like there are paintings of the Odessa cloth that show like remarkably similar proportions as far as like the width and the placement of the face and stuff. So it kind of looks like though that if the shroud is the same as the Odessa cloth, it would have been one thing because there's not really a lot of evidence that the shroud was ever like broken into pieces. But then again, there could have been a separate cloth that Jesus provided
Well,
for
I mean,
whatever reason.
it just I don't know, and I haven't seen any of the other pictures yet, so maybe I should hold off when I'm thinking. But I mean, if the whole thing is got to be like beach towel size to be the whole body,
This is very large. It's large
so
enough for
even if
everybody.
it's folded up, then it's going to be pretty thick. Is kind of what I'm getting at. It's going to have some density to it. Like,
Yeah, well, as you'll see, there's a lot of anomalies about the shroud.
okay,
Yeah.
again, I'll try. I feel like, are you going to answer a lot of these questions for me? Like, am I just jumping the gun on things I'm going to find out here in a little bit?
No, keep jumping the gun
Okay.
because there's a lot of questions about this. The Odessa thing, I'm almost starting with a side thing because I just wanted to put that idea out there that there's at least some legend that a similar cloth existed as far
Also,
back as the New Testament times.
I'm not real familiar at all with burial practices of the time. I did not realize it was basically just like they folded a towel around them as like a way to
Burial
bury.
shroud, yeah,
Yeah, I didn't realize that's what that was. I guess.
yeah. They would take a shroud and they would wrap you in it, basically.
All right.
Um, so let's
I'm a
see.
little caught up on the weird like anomalies that are going on, like at his shoulders and at his knees. I realize this is probably folds. It still looks really weird though.
Yeah, we'll get into that question.
Okay.
We'll get into some of the anomalies. There's a lot of anomalies. This
Okay.
is still an open question. This is not one of those things that's like, oh, it was a legend and we figured it out. Like, there's still scientific studies going on of this today.
So it's in possession. It's still in scientific possession. Like it's still being studied. Like
There's
okay.
like basically a society. I think actually the Vatican might have it. We'll get into its future.
Okay.
So what we do know, however, is that at some point this appears the Odessa cloth and the shroud appear to have some corresponding dates, such as it being lost in one place and then moved to another place. This 944 date when it was moved to Constantinople, and then the disappearance 1204 date are dates that kind of connect these two cloths.
Okay.
So we let's see here. So the physical shroud, the shroud that I showed you a picture of, is
Mm-hmm.
remarkable in its own right and worthy of scientific and historical research. It's a rectangular piece of cloth woven from linen with the approximate length dimension of 14 feet 3 inches by 3 feet 7 inches.
Well, it's even bigger than I thought it was.
It's enough to wrap around a body.
Okay. 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 Well, okay, those first anomalies that I was talking about then kind of make a little bit more sense now. Now that I'm kind of picturing it wrapping around something or somebody.
Yes, and another basic thing, which I know everyone who knows anything about the shroud will know, but another basic thing to remember is that like burial shrouds were a thing for a long time. They do not leave imprints of bodies.
Okay, that is a good thing to clarify. I'd assume that it was not a normal thing.
No, it's not normal at all.
Like, but I don't know. I know, like, I believe they perfumed bodies and stuff though, so they didn't stink. So I thought maybe oil might play into that in some way.
Some foreign substance, possibly. People have studied
Yes,
that. Yep, people have studied whether or
and
not
that's
some.
not the case.
We'll see.
Okay. Okay.
So the shroud is not to believe to have been woven to these particular specifications. Instead, these English dimensions are only approximate measures given to the nearest inch. The more accurate specification dimensions of the shroud is that the dimensions used by those who crafted the shroud is 8 cubits long by 2 cubits wide.
Okay, that makes more sense.
This specification conforms.
Biblically, I mean.
Yeah, right, exactly. And it lines up more with that than any other European measurement. This specification conforms with a cubit equivalent of 21.6 inches. Interestingly, a cubit of 21.6 inches corresponds to the ancient Assyrian cubit. Assyrian culture, but not the empire, of course, survived well into Christian times, so there are at least hints that the shroud may have been woven outside of Palestine proper in some other area once part of the Assyrian Empire. In any case, the linen of the shroud is a textile made from the fibers of the flax plant, Linum usitaceum, which such linen textiles appear to be some of the oldest in the world, and their history goes back many thousands of years.
Interesting.
The weave used to manufacture the shroud linen is of a particularly elegant and apparently rare 3/1 herringbone weave.
Oh, that's one of my favorite weaves.
That's top five weaves at least. I think it's
I haven't
everyone's
been
top
able to
five
pull it
weaves.
off myself, but I mean, someday I'm hoping with enough practice I can finally get to that herringbone 3/1 weave.
Yeah, it's an ancient, it's an oldie but a goodie.
Yeah.
So we know it's old. We know it's old cloth made of something that would have been near Palestine, um, and a type of weaving that would have been done there as well. When the carbon dating of the shroud was performed in 1988, a concerted effort was made to find a control sample of linen from the Middle Ages that matched the weave of the shroud, but none could be found.
Okay.
And here we're going to start to get into the controversy because there's questions about how accurate carbon dating is. There's questions about how do you even carbon date something that old that would have been handled by a lot of people at different times. But already the fact that this was a type of weaving that was not done in the Middle Ages when this was, if you believe it was falsely created, no one else was weaving things around this time that way.
Okay.
So it would have had to have been someone in the Middle Ages who knew how ancient Assyrians near Palestine weaved a particular cloth and known that somehow that could be found out in the future.
Yeah,
It
that
seems
is a weird extra detail that you wouldn't think anybody would necessarily go to.
no, it's not. It would be a very extra step that nobody at the time would even know how to.
Yeah, so I mean, also, how would you even be aware of that? I mean, I guess you could. You could have historians, I guess, that are keeping track of things. I don't know. It does seem like a very far leap for somebody trying to falsify something.
Yeah, it seems like a long way to go for just a prank, basically.
Yeah, you'd think you'd just get similar material.
If even that back
I
then.
mean, aging would be the bigger problem, really. I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, so
Probably not. Probably not made in the Middle Ages.
So they couldn't find anything from the Middle Ages, but neither could they find anything comparable from the first century. Highlighting the rarity of the shroud was a news story that circulated around the world in the popular press in late 2019. The story concerned the discovery of a first century burial garment or shroud in Jerusalem. Archaeologist Shimon Gibson, who excavated the site for the Israel Antiquities Authority, stated that, quote, in all of the approximately 1,000 tombs from the first century AD, which have been excavated around Jerusalem, not one fragment of a shroud has been found until now, and we really hit the jackpot, he said. The newly discovered burial cloth was a simple plain 1/1 weave, nothing like the shroud. Some experts have claimed that the new study casts doubt on the Shroud of Turin as Jesus' burial cloth. We concur with that opinion. The shroud is even rarer than the 1 in a 1,000 find in Jerusalem, and more importantly, as the study shows, is simply too fine a cloth to have been woven for the purpose of a burial garment. When the Institute's John Jackson first worked hands on with the shroud back in 1978, and we'll get back to John Jackson later, as a leader of the STURP, the Shroud of Turin Research Project team, he recalled that he was moved by the beauty of the shroud and that it seemed to flow out of the table like water.
That's a weird comment.
Well, it's a very weird piece of thing. So we have no evidence that they were sewing like this in the Middle Ages. We have some evidence that they were sewing like this back in the first century, but we've never found an actual. This is how controversial this is, but because we've never found an actual burial cloth that's sewn like it, but we've only found one other burial cloth ever. And keep in mind, Jesus was, and this is not in the show notes, but like he was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, a rich man.
Yeah.
So it's possible they had a burial cloth prepared that was, because this type of weaving is more fine than the type that they found in the one
Like
out of a
something
thousand
somebody that's
fine.
well off in that time might have had prepared.
It's a finer, rarer way to weave something.
Yeah.
So yeah, so if he had borrowed the tomb and the burial shroud of a very rich man, you might expect it to be more like that. Was my first thought.
That's what I'm. Yeah.
So one is now prompted to ask, if the shroud was not woven as a burial cloth, for what purpose might have it been made? The New Testament statement, Mark 15:46, that the sindon was purchased from Joseph of Arimathea, who according to the gospel account was a wealthy man, and the fact that Jesus directed his disciples to secure the upper room for the Last Supper from a quote owner who he somehow knew raises some intriguing possibilities. We believe there is important empirical evidence associated with the shroud itself concerning the cloth's use prior to being used as a burial cloth. There's another fairly recent development concerning the quote fineness of the shroud worth mentioning here. After the 1532 fire that partially damaged the shroud, a protective backing cloth was stitched to the shroud to help preserve it. In 2002, a team of textile historians and preservationists removed the backing cloth to promote the preservation of the shroud. Needless to say, this was controversial. Although the work was done in good faith, some shroud researchers, including some from the Shroud Institute, believe that the project may have compromised some empirical shroud data. Nevertheless, an interesting and valuable finding was made. In the course of the restoration, a peculiar stitching pattern in the seam of one long side of the shroud, called a selvage, was revealed. The stitching was the work of a quote professional, stated restoration team leader and Swiss textile historian Miss Metzchild Fleury Limburg in a PBS interview. More interesting still, she found that the stitching to be quite similar to stitching found in cloth fragments found in the tombs of the Jewish fortress of Masada. The Masada cloths date from between 40 BC and 73 AD, when the fortress of Masada fell to the Romans. So, boom, we put it right in the lifetime of Christ. Yeah.
Yep.
Fleury Limburg further stated, corroborating John Jackson's first impression, that the shroud, quote, weave was special in antiquity because it denoted an extraordinary quality. Fleury Limburg wrapped up her PBS interview with the statement that, quote, the linen cloth of the Shroud of Turin does not display any weaving or sewing techniques which would speak against its origins as a high quality product of textile workers in the first century. Ooh, okay.
Okay, so it's probably from the right time period.
It's probably from the right time period until we start getting into carbon dating stuff, which we'll get into.
Okay.
So the most remarkable thing about the shroud is not the linen itself, of course, although much more needs to be said about the linen, including a thorough discussion of the carbon dating done in 1988. The 1988 testing dated the linen to the 14th century. The most remarkable thing about the shroud is that imprinted on the fabric is what appears to the naked eye to be a faint, ghostly image of a crucified man. So, for centuries, the Shroud of Turin was revered for the light, sepia colored, and hard to discern image of a man bearing the wounds many believers held to be consistent with the trauma wounds of scourging and crucifixions. In limited circles, some even came to venerate the cloth as being the burial cloth of the Jesus of Nazareth. And I have here a painting done in the Renaissance era of the cloth. And this is what it looked like. You've seen the X-ray. This is what it looked like. You see what the three angels are holding?
Yeah.
That's what it looks like to the naked eye.
Yeah.
Um,
Like it's fully laid around. Like it starts at the feet, it wraps up around the back over the head, and then comes back down towards the feet. So you get an imprint of the front and the back of an entire body, with
right.
hands crossed over groin, basically.
Yeah, so remember it was like 14 feet or 8 cubits long. So it looks like what they would do is they would lay this basically sheet out longwise. They'd put the body on the first half, they'd wrap the top half over you, and then they'd wrap you up in it.
Okay.
But keep in mind this image here of and how different and less detailed that is than the image you saw before.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is yeah. I mean, this is a painting of it.
It's a painting, yes, but we'll see some picture comparisons here in a moment.
Okay.
So for years and years throughout the Middle Ages into the present times, some thought it was a burial cloth of Jesus. It appeared faintly to be the outline. You could barely see it of somebody who had undergone crucifixion. But then in 1898, things took a dramatic turn. When the shroud was being exhibited in Turin, an amateur photographer by the name of Secunda Pia was invited to take the very first photographs of the shroud. On the evening of May 28th, 1898, that's my birthday, by the way, including
You were born in 1898.
1898. Yeah, exactly. Secunda Pia was invited to take the first photos on May 28, 1898, and this is where things get really interesting. During the normal course of developing his photographic plates, Pia was startled to see the unmistakable image of a crucified man that was nothing like the image seen by the naked eye when looking at the shroud. The image he saw looked very much like a true photographic positive. The image of the shroud. Yeah, before this, people thought maybe it was painted, maybe it was the real shroud, who knows? The image of the shroud itself must then logically be the photographic like negative. So he took a picture of the shroud,
Yeah.
and the picture looked like the negatives. He's in his room trying to you know how they used to have to turn film from negative to positive?
Yeah.
The negative looked like a positive. It became way more lifelike.
Yeah. No, that's crazy.
Yeah. So for somehow we have a photographic negative on a burial cloth that looks like it was woven in the first century. This is just the beginning of the weirdness. So this discovery was propagated around the world. Widespread popular interest in the shroud was kindled, and for the first time, scientific eyebrows were being raised. Modern scientific interest in the shroud can be said to have begun with Pia's photographs, and that interest has continued to grow to the present day. The scientific significance of Pia's discovery is twofold. First, the shading of the shroud's body image is like a negative, where the shades of light and dark are reversed from the way they normally appear in ordinary visual appearance. That is, we're used to seeing people with light highlights and dark shadows, but the shroud, this shading convention is reversed. The immediate question that arises from this result is how could the shroud sensibly be the work of an artist or craftsman? Such a person working in the Middle Ages around the year 1357, when the shroud first surfaced in Europe in the tiny village of Liry, France, would have worked with an absolutely unfamiliar and unnaturally shading structure before the advent of photography. If the shroud is older then the dilemma simply becomes more perplexing. The second significant aspect of Pia's discovery is that the information density or correlation with the anatomical subtleties of the human body is exceedingly high, well surpassing what was expected of artists' renditions of the human form by even the great masters of the Renaissance. In the negative, the image indeed appears to have been the quality of a detail of a photograph. During the first part of the Shroud's history, it was seen as a novelty. It would have been shown for various occasions, weddings or coronations, etc. But interest in it wasn't very widely expressed. It wasn't until 1898 when the amateur photographer by the name of Secondo Pia was allowed to take the first photograph that the interest began to grow. This was a time when photography was still very new. Secondo Pia took a photograph of the face of the image of the shroud, and as he developed the negative glass plate, he expected to see a ghost-like image of the face in which it was filmed. So I have here on the left a picture of what it looks like to the naked eye,
Mm-hmm.
and on the right
Which
is a
still looks
photo of
weird.
the negative. Right.
Which,
You can see by looking at the naked eye why people thought it was a person crucified. But when you look at the image on the right, which is a photographic negative, it becomes way more detailed, which is
yeah.
bizarre. Yeah.
Yeah, it looks very detailed. It looks like a man with some sort of a beard and some long hair.
Yeah, it becomes extremely more detailed. It's also, as I stated, nobody would have, if this was a painting, nobody would have painted it in reverse. There also would be no reason to, because we were hundreds of years from
Yeah, they wouldn't
photography.
have known that that was a thing that would have been a possibility as far as
Right.
somebody being able to see
There's
it.
no reason. You would paint it to look more like the thing on the right instead of the thing on the left.
Yeah.
So this shocked Secundo Pia so much that he almost dropped the glass plate. And after careful thought, he realized that what we see when he took the shroud with our own eyes is a negative image, an image where the light values are reversed. And when he took a negative of the negative, this is the test on your math, two negatives equal a positive, he received a positive image, an image we would expect to see from a fully developed photograph today.
Do you have that
This
photograph?
Well, that's the first photo. That's the first. What he's saying is
Oh,
the negative, the thing on the right is what you would see in 1898 from a photograph. Keep in mind
I
that's
thought you were getting ready to
as real
drop
as
like a colorized photo on me or something.
well. There's no well. It doesn't appear that it doesn't appear that there was color. It appears that there was some event, and people theorize a lot of different things, whether it's radiation or spiritual. Something left a negative imprint on the shroud.
Yeah.
But if you think about how photography looked in 1898, the thing on the right is about as close to a picture as you're getting. Um,
I mean, that's true too.
so,
Yeah, considering camera quality, then yeah, it's a pretty good improvement from the image from the first image, what it looks like to the naked eye, where it's just like kind of a ghostly. I mean, they both look very ghostly. Um,
but but the one on the left, the naked eye image, you could see how somebody might paint something that way. You know what I mean? Or
yeah.
put something on someone's body or face, like you said, to like create an image. Um,
My next thing is like, okay, so is that supposed to be like a little bit of Christ's blood on that?
yeah.
Interesting.
So this, of course, caused a lot of interest in the shroud when they could see that it appeared to be some sort of ancient, whether it was the Middle Ages or the first century, it still boggles the mind how someone basically created a photographic negative. In 1931, Giuseppe Erni was allowed to take more pictures, and this time he took full body pictures. The hidden images were so detailed that doctors and pathologists were able to do an actual medical diagnosis of the man in the shroud.
All right. I guess by 1931 standards, yeah, they could probably do a full.
Well, you'll see an example. I included an example of some of the diagrams, but it is clear the better photographs they could take that you could start to see individual wounds and
Okay.
stuff that would have been even harder to paint in negative. It starts to get super specific, and it all starts to match up with the biblical story.
Okay.
So in 1902, the French chemist Paul Vignon, in studying Pia's photograph, thought that the intensity of the shroud's image seemed to vary with expected cloth body distance. That is, the closer the draping shroud was to her presumed underlying body, the more intense was the body image. While he could not demonstrate this observation quantitatively at that time, he nevertheless proposed that the image was due to ammonia vapors emanating from the body's surface as an attempt to explain the distance correlation. That's pretty close to your idea of there being like a substance on the body
Yeah.
that somehow like stain the shroud, but whether it's a substance or ammonia vapors, this kind of mathematically shows that it's not like somebody laid out a cloth and painted it evenly. It's like the farther away, like if you were wrapped in a shroud, like your temple would be farther away than your forehead, your nose would be closer than your lip. You know what I'm saying? Like the different parts of the body being different parts, the parts that you would expect when you look at it, even like the nose seems to show up better. The
Talking
parts that
about the
you would,
contour because of the way the cloth's going to lay across the body and where there's
yeah,
going
if
to
you
be
put a
peaks and
towel,
valleys.
yeah, and the peaks and valley parts seem to show up better on the negatives.
Yeah.
Which goes further into the idea that this was actually somehow the image of a body that was actually wrapped in a cloth left an image on the cloth.
Okay.
So, 1931, the shroud was photographed again. Giuseppe Erni and another Italian. These photographs show the negative characteristics of the shroud with even more fidelity. So here are the better photos from about 30 years later. And it's starting to look more like a 3D model of a head to me.
Yeah.
The better and better technology we get, the more it looks like this is actually some person's imprint on this.
Oh yeah, it's
So,
definitely. I'm pretty convinced this is a person's imprint on this. Like,
yeah, but how is the question? How and
yeah,
when? How and when? I mean, there are theories that we don't even necessarily get into here. Some people think that Leonardo da Vinci might have been experimenting with like a proto camera and created this in some way.
I could,
But we have no,
okay.
but we have no necessary evidence that he was actually doing that, even though we have all his helicopter drawings and all that stuff. You know what I mean? Like people have theorized just about everything, basically.
I could see that as somehow using light and some sort of fabric to do a one-to-one image size of a person in some way, maybe.
Yeah. But there are some other complications that, again, we'll get into, such as the fact that
If
just
that would,
like there, oh, go ahead.
you go ahead.
Well, just like there's the effect that the parts of the body closer to the shroud show up more clear, there's also appears to be a 3D effect. There appears to be an effect that things were imprinted on the shroud as they would be in 3D.
Yeah. Okay.
So not only would Leonardo da Vinci or some unnamed genius who never did anything other than play this prank invent a camera, they invented like a 3D camera, basically.
That was kind of my thing is like, okay, well, if he did do it, this would have been pretty successful for the time, unless I guess he wouldn't know about taking a picture of it to see how detailed it really is.
You would basically already have to know the basics of photography in order to create this. So
Yeah, you would think there would be a more detailed version at some point, or
or
would have
other
developed.
or other things that he would have tried it on other things or other
Yeah,
people. The fact that it's just this one thing and it appears to be Christ is extremely bizarre.
Yeah. Okay.
So in 1974, it became technically possible to to
You've been doing so good.
rigorously test Vignon's intensity versus cloth body hypothesis. Using a microdensitometer, an instrument that measures intensity of a photograph, and a reconstruction of how a cloth model of a shroud drapes over a body, American physicist John Jackson and colleagues were able to show that indeed, image intensity does vary with cloth distance with a high degree of correlation. It occurred to Jackson and his team that this correlation might be empirically demonstrated using a special image analysis technique. The thought was to plot image intensity as a corresponding levels of three-dimensional topographical relief. The hypothesis was that if the intensities of the shroud image do indeed correlate with cloth to body distance, then the resulting relief image should correspond to a sensible three-dimensional form of a human body, excluding any second order effect of the cloth drape. Early in 1976, the opportunity to empirically test the team's hypothesis presented itself. And on February 19th, 1976, Jackson brought a photograph of the shroud to the Image Analysis Laboratory in Sandia National Laboratories, Bill Montern. The shroud image was studied using an analog computer called a VP8 image analyzer that was able to directly convert the image intensity to vertical relief. Astonishingly, the image itself was anatomically correct for a human body, even down to the subtle details of the face. Now, the anatomical correctness thing alone is a big discovery they had in the 70s, because even a very well made picture or like portrait or painting isn't always like statistically correct at how something will look if you take a photograph of it.
Okay.
Now we can see some of these images here, and they start to notice, and this, of course, is not a negative, so you can't see it as clearly, but you can make out, if you look at the very center of this photograph, you can see basically the head resting against itself. Do you see that?
Yes.
And you can see how the left half of the head is the face, and the back half is the back of the head. There's no face or anything.
Yeah.
And if you work your way down the body, you notice that it's all basically, it looks like an X-ray, basically. This
Yeah.
looks like an ancient X-ray. And even down to injuries, which you had asked about earlier, which are what's called poker holes here in this image. Um, there's also some fold markings, but it it looks like someone took an X-ray of someone's body, basically. Both halves line up perfectly, and they're anatomically correct for a human. It's not just like a cartoon image.
Yeah.
So the empirical fact that the shroud's frontal body image is highly correlated with the cloth body distance presents major problems for the hypothesis describing the origin of the shroud image. First, the fundamental three-dimensional characteristic of the image argues forcefully that it could not be the work of an artist. And that is true. Like if you were going to create Jesus put his face on something and create an image, why would you also do the back of his head? And it
Yeah.
all lines up perfectly. Controlled experiments with highly trained artists have demonstrated that the human eye brain coordination system is incapable of both recognizing and creating an intensity correlation to the degree found on the shroud. Dr. Jackson and his team have used the VP8 system while investigating numerous artistic copies of the shroud produced over the past several centuries. Without exception, these images appear quite distorted. Moreover, there appear to be no artistic examples in history where someone thought to intentionally encode the intensity structure of their artwork with three-dimensional meaning. So, oh boy. I mean, at this point, it's like, okay, is it Jesus? Like, we don't know. Um, but it's looking like someone took a 3D diagram of a body using photographic techniques either 2 millennia or 1 millennia before any of this was ever conceived.
Yeah.
It seems to match up amazingly with how close your skin would be to the body. It seems to match up with the two halves and like how big a body would be. And there's also numerous artistic examples of people trying to do it and they just couldn't. And also, like I was saying earlier, if you had succeeded in creating something like this, why is this the only thing like it that exists, basically?
Yeah.
If you invented some kind of amazing 3D scope camera back in the Middle Ages, you think you would use it for something else, some kind of other study. Um, and that's kind of why I like the idea that maybe if this isn't an actual relic, it was some sort of scientific study in some way. Now, why the person has the marks of crucifixion, I don't know. But it appears to be created in a way that we have no idea how it was created.
Yeah. No, it's yeah, I've never heard or seen anything like this before. This is
I'm very happy that I'm introducing you to this.
yeah, I
I
was
feel like I've
somehow
heard about
not
this all my life.
I somehow yeah, was not aware of this really at all.
So basically, we can reject on the basis of the intensity distance correlation the hypothesis that the image was the result of a direct contact transfer from a body to the cloth, because we see body image discoloration on the shroud where the cloth contact is extremely doubtful. So that goes against your oils theory, basically. Um, I'll just cut to the chase. There appears to be some kind of light transfer happened, and it kind of appears to have happened from within the shroud. Like a
Okay.
3D photograph was somehow imprinted on the shroud from the inside. Um, and it doesn't match up with stuff touching the shroud because parts of the body that wouldn't have touched it at all are also imprinted. Um, it's just very bizarre. Let's see here. We can also exclude simple diffusion or radiation from a body shape because both transfer mechanisms, while acting through a space, would produce a blurred image. The latter category of some sort of radiation transfer, in fact, rejects Vignon's ammonia vapor diffusion hypothesis discussed under at our previous in our previous readings. In 1978, the shroud was studied firsthand by a team of professional scientists from the United States that came to be known as STURP, STURP, the Shroud of Turin Research Project. Dr. Jackson was one of the leaders of the STURP team that was composed of scientists from universities, scientific laboratories, and the industry, as well as other experts in fields of photography and microscopy. Among the major conclusions of the STURP team were that the blood stains on the shroud are real human blood and that the body image is absent beneath the blood stains. This leads to the straightforward conclusion that the blood was on the cloth before the image.
Yeah.
This is another condition that must be taken into account by any image formation hypothesis. Another STURP conclusion was that the image itself is chemically a form of degraded cellulose. That is, the body image is the result of a molecular change in the linen cellulose with a chemistry similar to that induced by scorching. Although a thermal explanation for the image seems unlikely, further, no extraneous chemical agents of any significance were detected that could be associated with the image. Significantly, again, this means that no paint or paint binding materials, oils, etc., were used. Also, the body image was shown to reside only on the surface or upmost fibrils of the cloth. Nothing was penetrated or seeped into the underlying fabric, as you would expect if it was a some kind of foreign substance put on it.
Yeah.
At the microscopic level, the brownish colored fibrils in the body image could be seen lying atop and next to the white underlying white fibrils that that comprise the threads that make up the weave of the shroud.
Yeah, so
That
this
part
is
got me. Oh, go ahead.
yeah, that's that gets me as well. That there's like this isn't something that got put on this fabric like in any
No.
sort of way. Like yeah, the light thing. I'm just thinking over the light thing. Like this is yeah. Wow, this is weird.
Yes. Um, so considering all of the image characteristics, there still is yet to be a satisfactory explanation or hypothesis for the shroud image formation mechanism. In late 2009, there was a sensation in the popular press concerning an effort made by a team in Italy to produce a body image that could be compared to the shroud. So we tried to recreate this either 800 years later or 2,000 years later, deciding on what you believe. And this well-funded effort has fallen well short of the mark. And I looked up further stuff since the creation of this, and nobody's ever been able to recreate this.
I've been kind of holding that question for a little bit is because yeah, that would you would think be the next logical thing to do is create something similar to this in some way, in some fashion, whether it involves our technology or not.
And then work your way back.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
How could we do this in a simpler way?
We can't use our technology to create this.
All right, well that's even weirder.
So I'm going to end with a list of evidence that the shroud is genuine.
Okay.
Sources and show notes. So the scientists in 1978 concluded the image of the shroud was not painted on as they could not explain how it was made, and that the blood responded to X-ray analysis, thermography, and chemical analysis the same way as the real type AB blood does. So this thing said blood on it. And it was not a forgery based on the conclusion that an image like the one on the shroud could not be made using any known modern or ancient method. Some scientists have suggested that the carbon dating done in 1988 may have been affected by the 1532 fire or microorganisms that had attached themselves to the cloth in recent centuries. Carbon dating works only on samples less than 5,700 years old. After a living thing dies, that ratio of carbon-14 isotopes to carbon-12 isotopes decays at a known rate. The measurement of this ratio with a high-energy mass spectrometer reveals the date. And that's another thing. This thing was buried in a wall. It was part of a fire. It's been handled by hundreds of people. Just to take a small sample and say how old is the carbon,
It's kind of hard to do.
just the fire alone, it's odd to me too that we know this thing existed since about the 1200s.
Yeah.
And it's weird that the fire and the dating seem to line up. It seems to line up to around the time that it mysteriously caught on fire.
Yeah, weren't at one point you bring it up that they were possibly pointing to like the 1400s as a possible time that it could have been made?
Yeah, I mean the possible times based on how nobody knows.
But there's record of it in Constantinople in 1200.
There's record of something similar, yeah, being taken in 1200 and being presented much earlier. The weaving seems to be consistent with the lifetime of Christ, 400 or 40 BC to about 70, 80. Everything about this is a mismatch. It makes, and honestly, I mean, to me, and maybe I'm biased, the whole carbon dating thing is like the weakest part of evidence. Because you would have to have, it seems to line up very well with when the fire happened, which would like corrupt carbon dating.
You would have to have some way to get a clean sample from it, from like inside of it, which you can't really do. because of what it is, 'cause it's cloth.
Yeah, they've taken little
It's not
pieces
like a rock
off.
or a tree or I don't know, anything that's got some mass to it. Like I don't think you would normally use the outer edge surface of something, that's been touched a whole lot and moved around and burned and
And I think that most of the tests have been to the outer edges.
well, that's what I mean. Like, and even
Yeah,
I'm saying on a cloth, I don't know how much better you could get off of that anyway.
right. And I just don't believe that something that's been on fire or in a fire is not going to be contaminated by that, because a
Well, yeah.
fire is burning carbon. It's
Well, and
wood
cloth
or
and cloth is going to absorb some level of that. Everybody's been in something, anything that's carpeted that like gets a bunch of smoke on it. Like it always kind of has a smoky smell to it. Doesn't matter what you
right.
do to it.
This is not a, I mean, I believe in the science of carbon dating to an extent, but this is not like a tree ring that was freshly cut out of a tree.
That's what I'm saying.
This is something that's been through a lot. And
Yeah.
it's cloth. Exactly. Yeah, you're right. So let's see. So that was number one. In 1997, scientists reported that pollen found on the shroud matches that of plant species found only in Palestine or in the
That's,
Palestine area.
well, that is weird that it's still got pollen on it.
Yeah, but I mean, look, I'm not a textile genius, but if it does have the pollen from Palestine, it probably got it from prior to the Middle Ages, because we know where it's been since then.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the carbon dating. I'm like, well, if they're finding pollen on it, maybe they are able to. I don't know. It's a
Yeah, but
weird
then
thing
why does
that's made it through the wall and all the people handling it and a fire and it still got pollen on it from when it was made.
But I'm not a molecular scientist. I don't know if
I'm not
pollen
either.
becomes part of, you know what I mean?
That's
I
true.
mean,
That there may be something that happens down in the fibers, possibly.
yeah, kind of like the blood. They can obviously test and find out it's real blood.
That's true.
And that, so analysis done in 1999 at the Hebrew International University showed that the pollen came from around Jerusalem area sometime in the 8th century. So
Okay.
that's even weirder. So we got pollen in the, so that could possibly be from before it was hidden in the wall in the 900s.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily have to be from, that's the thing, is like, this is my thing with the shroud, is like anything that's later than Jesus people take as evidence that it's not. But like, this thing has admittedly, even based on legend, been slowly moved north. It's experienced fires. It's been hidden in a wall. It's been hanging out in Turkey. You know what I mean? It's like,
The people thought it was important for a while.
right. And to say, for instance, oh, well, we know it's not from Jesus' time because the pollen was probably from the 8th century. It's like, one, what was it doing? You just said it was a fake that was created in the Middle Ages in the 1500s. What was it doing in Palestine in the 8th century? You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
if you really start adding and subtracting, you're just like, okay, so that's evidence that it's older than when you said it was faked, and then the weaving is evidence that it's older from when you said it was fake, and you just start working your way back. I mean, a person who believes this was, whether or not you believe it was a burial shroud, if you believe it was weaved in 30 AD, it's not, the fact that you find pollen from Palestine in the 8th century doesn't hurt your case. The thing had to keep existing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But the fact that you find pollen from the 8th century definitely hurts your case that it's a fraud from
Middle.
1200.
Yeah.
Yeah. So pollen grain found in the shroud matches grains from a relic kept at the Cathedral of Oviedo, Spain, called the Sidarium. And the Sidarium has been dated to the 1st century and has also been described as a burial facial cloth of Jesus. And I kind of think maybe the Sidarium, this might be a whole other episode, might be the actual, that cloth from the turkey story.
Yeah.
There might be numerous of these. Both the shroud and the Sidarium appear to carry type AB blood. Plus, they have the same pattern of blood stain and the same kinds of pollen.
Weird.
There's no traces of any paint on the shroud. The image is a negative. It is unlikely medieval forgers could have made such an image. They have no knowledge of photography. The body was prepared in a way that is consistent with burials in Jesus' time, except some scholars believe hands were folded across the chest, not placed on the groin. John Jackson, the physicist from the University of Colorado, has hypothesized that the cloth was contaminated by high levels of carbon monoxide and that this caused the carbon 14 test to be off. His assertion has been taken seriously enough that Oxford has said it will work with him to get permission to test the shroud again. In addition, Los Alamos National Laboratory presented research that in the 1988 finding might be off because the piece of cloth sampled might be a medieval addition added during repairs, which would be around the edges. Jackson, just like you said, Jackson also asserts that there's too much evidence that the shroud is older than carbon-14 tests concluded and that the matter needs a fresh look. And this continues to this day.
Well, I mean, the argument of it being a possible repair piece that got tested, that makes a lot of sense. We already know that it's been at different points, at least at one other point that we've talked about, it's been somebody tried to repair it by tacking on another piece behind it.
Yep.
To like try and hold it together. So
exactly.
Maybe there was smaller stuff going on before then, or who knows?
Who knows? All we know is that it's what got me is that it's a weaving from the 1st century. We have no idea how to even create this image, even to this day. If it was some sort of photography experiment, it's remarkably advanced, and we have no other examples like it. When you look at the image, you can see different wounds that were associated with this crucifixion. There's human blood on it. It appears to be a 3D image. I don't know. It's a lot. It's a lot. It's one of those things where it's like, if you want to say the verdict's still out, fine. But like, there's so much. I don't believe the hoax theory. I don't believe that it was created as a hoax.
No, I don't. Based on everything, now at the end, like I kind of felt that way towards the beginning, but now that I've kind of heard everything, yeah, no, I don't think this is a hoax. That somebody like it would have. I think one, it would have been more apparent looking to the naked eye, first of all, if you were trying to make it look like a thing that you could claim it as this burial cloth. You know what I mean?
Right.
It would look more like that negative image than just this faint outline sort of thing.
Right. If you're
and
trying
also
to create
we would be able to figure out how to make that forgery.
Right. Which we cannot. Nobody can figure out how that got on the shroud. So that's the Shroud of Turin. That's an introduction, I guess, to the Shroud of Turin. Now, I got into a lot of other stuff when I was going into this that we're eventually going to get into. This blood type thing, remember that.
Okay.
It might not be a next episode. It might not be for another few months, but there's a lot of miraculous things that keep happening that show up with the same blood type. So that appeared on the so that's it, man. I hope you enjoyed.
Yeah, it was very interesting. Yeah, I wasn't really aware of that. Weird. That's just I know I keep saying it, but it's just this is weird.
I'd love to give you a final answer, like, and then they proved it was fake, or and then they proved it's real. But like, this is one of those things that, I mean, it's so controversial and it's such an important relic that there are just constant attempts or questions to test it, and then people are like, no, that would mess it up. It's just this constant controversy, basically.
Yeah.
But I keep going back to what you were saying. Like, if you were going to create a fake in 1200 to 1500 AD, why and how is it a photographic negative that appears to be it just seems like that's just the biggest waste of your time, unless you're the biggest troll in the world and you're like, sometime in 500 years somebody will figure out what I'm doing. It wasn't even important enough. They would take it out for weddings and stuff prior to the 1800s. I mean, it spent at least 500 years being basically a novelty, nobody knew of these photographic properties. I don't know. Something's up with the shroud.
Yeah.
I personally I lean close to 80% or 90% that this is somehow associated. This is somehow associated with the burial of Jesus. I personally, um, just because there's so many anomalies. But whatever story would go behind it being a fake is would be so incredible and ridiculous. I wouldn't mind being wrong. You know, I mean, it wouldn't shake my faith. I don't base my faith on the Shroud of Turin. Um, but yeah, I look forward. Hopefully, maybe in the future we have less intrusive ways of studying it, and we can figure out more things. But a lot of evidence. So thanks for listening.
Yeah, thanks for putting that together, Dennis. That was fun. Yeah, thank you everybody for listening. Like, rate, subscribe, tell a friend, share the show. We appreciate it. We see all of it. Thank you for putting this together, Dennis.
Thank you. I'm sure we're gonna have a lot of opinions about this one.
Possibly.
Peace out. I love you, Patrick.
I love you too.